working as a host. Yes.
There. Okay.
Awesome.
I'll go back to share.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the objectives of our presentation are providing you the opportunity to discuss the need for culturally competent mental health counselors, specifically for members of the Asian population. We'll have the opportunity to discuss the role of a disruptive innovator. And we'll also be able to apply principles of cultural sensitivity in attracting members of the Asian population into the counseling profession. So really, to start with, what do we mean by a disruptive innovator? Our experience of how people have been disruptive innovators is where they have been able to adopt Is it okay to keep going?
Thank you. Sorry. Continue, Dr. Massfeller.
Sorry, I don't understand what you're saying because it's breaking up.
I can hear you just fine. Is everybody else?
I'll just keep going unless someone tells me to stop. So what is a disruptive innovator? It's someone who's defined as a person who creates a unique approach to a business or an initiative. One example is in mental health care in Canada, where in North America, where telehealth has been used to provide mental health care to rural and remote communities in Northern Canada, offering them the ability to have both mental health care and general health care, where it may not have initially been available to them using technology. Could I have the next slide, please, Alyssa?
Which is neat. Thank you, Helen. So when we talk about disruptive innovator, we also want to talk about cultural self-awareness, because with a lot of the things with disruptive innovator, you have to look at different aspects of when you're becoming an innovator. So one is your self-awareness. And so as counselors, we're very aware, we need to be aware of the different cultures of the clients that we service. So some questions that you want to think about and ask yourself is, what do you think about self-awareness? And one of the first questions is, what is your self-identity? I don't know if any of you want to share when that question is asked, or if you ask yourself. Another one you can ask is, what historical events have shaped your life and experiences? And with that question, how does that affect how you approach clients? How do you ask the questions of a client? Another one is your values. How do you see your values playing a role when you're doing therapy? Do I have a clear sense of my own ethnic, cultural, and racial identity? When those questions are asked, are you questioning yourself? And if you do question those things, how does that also affect the way you're approaching your clients? Am I aware of the assumptions that I hold about people's cultures different from my own? Another aspect of self-awareness is counselors are learning to identify their biases. We talk about when we train novice counselors to look at their biases. And we have them ask the following questions. Do I hold assumptions about my culture, my gender, about my sexual orientation, certain stereotypes or impressions of the client? One thing that I do when I'm teaching novice counselors is I have them look at the implicit association test, which is called the Project Implicit. It's from Harvard. And some of the tests that they are asked to take, they can take weight, skin tone, gender, age, career, disability. Those are a couple to name a few. Another aspect is cultural knowledge. Now that's helping you to understand potential patterns among ethnic minority population. So how much knowledge do you have about your clients? And when you don't have that knowledge about the clients, how do you proceed with that? When I'm teaching cultural diversity or any of my therapy classes, a lot of the things that I tell the novice therapist is to be curious. What are you curious about when you're unsure of the client if they're discussing the different aspects of the culture? A big thing is culture humility. And that's the more you know about the client's culture, the more curious you're about and better outcomes. Therapists need to take a step down approach with clients from different cultures. The therapist should assume that they do not know what the client is saying, so ask those questions. Be curious about their background. Rather, they should partner up with the client. And, you know, I've had peers have gone to different events to understand their clients' cultures. So this is where it ties into the presentation. When we're talking about Asian American clients, would they feel more comfortable coming to an American individual? They would understand more of the counselor of coming from an individual background or collectivist background.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about individualistic worldview and collectivist worldview, and then the intersectionality of that. I think it's just a brief story. I grew up in Northern Ireland during the terrorism back in the late 70s and the 80s. And because of that, it kept a lot of diversity out of Northern Ireland. I think I saw my first person of color, a black man, when I was driving along the road at about 18 years of age. He popped up over the top of a cedar hedge which he was cutting at the end of his garden. And it was such an unusual experience because it was just completely out of context. And again, it pulls in that notion of social location. So when I came as a new immigrant to Canada to graduate school to start my counselling program, I was really embedded in this individualistic worldview. And the field I was entering was also firmly embedded in a historical, theoretical and pragmatic context where the boundaries, assumptions, values and beliefs associated with that field of study were individualistic. And within this individualistic worldview, I was really navigating this place of privilege, objectivity, imperialism, and linear models. Human nature was viewed in a very reductionistic manner, and the focus was on decontextualized and interfacic experience. So this very traditional approach to human problems and the change process is, was in terms of a locus of responsibility or control and locus of change or intervention within the individual, where things like growth and health were defined in terms of autonomy and independence from others rather than connection and mutuality. The ways of interacting with other counselors and with clients were really underscored with competitiveness and derived from power, privilege, and expertise. So it was quite a shock for me to come to understand that a heritage that I grew up in was referred to in North America as Eurocentric, because I was had shifted into a very different context. So the collectivist worldview and my work with working with diverse students who were coming into the counselor education program, and in particular my experience of working with 3 East Asian students from Vietnam, mainland China, and Hong Kong, really helped me to open up my own worldview and come to understand things differently. So it shifted to where I came to understand strong connections and interdependency among people and communities, and understanding strong relationships with land and place. In particular, the institution where I work at the present time We have a lot of Indigenous education programs beginning to emerge as a function of our work with the local Indigenous populations. So again, relationships, cultural identity, and health are viewed amongst these populations as holistic and systemic, and the needs of community and family are balanced with or taken priority over individual needs. The invitation is for us to engage with not only the clients themselves that come to seek counseling, but also their family members, and to access the knowledge, the cultural knowledge of the cultural knowledge holders, the elders in the community, and cultural healers in that counseling process as we work with the clients. So that was like really opening up and changing how decision making was revolving around what's best for the family or the community in the short and long-term work that we had with clients. And the theoretical perspectives were embedded in meaning, purpose, and health, intertwined within that social context, and where we're positioned as counselors in a more interpersonal and community-based place. So thanks Alyssa. So another term that was really useful in coming to understand how to work more effectively with diverse populations is this notion of intersectionality. An intersectional view of identity reveals the complexity and variability of experience, illustrating how it takes place within contexts that can be alternatively liberating or oppressive. So as counselors, it's our responsibility to attend to these intersections and interactions of multiple dimensions of cultural identity. It's no longer linear. It's not enough for us, even if from an ethical perspective, to consider that we are in these linear relationships or individualistic relationships. It's important to attend to the expression of intersection identities within the counselor-client relationship, looking for both the commonalities in our experiences as well as differences as they emerge, and really recognizing that by embracing intersectionality, it's a foundation for social justice practices and kind of breaking up the inequality across non-dominant populations in our society. So Ludwig said that the emerging or mingling of multiple markers of difference. And Collins, who's a Canadian counselor educator up in the BC area, she talks about the importance to attend to the expression of intersecting identities within the counselor-client relationship to address common experiences of social injustice and inequality.
So now I want to go over there's a couple of self-assessments of multicultural that you can do to determine your worldview. The first one is the Multicultural Awareness, Knowledge, and Skill Survey. I'm going to see if it'll take us out to give you the example. So here's a couple questions that you can take for it's a 60-item survey, and you can circle strongly disagree, I strongly agree, and they ask the different questions about, your culture is not external, but it's within a person. And then at the end, you can grade it, and they tell you a little about each of your score. And what I have with students is that, let me stop sharing this. Oh, sorry. So what I do in the beginning of the diversity class is that they take this survey and then they report their results. And what they have to do is they come up with SMART goals of what they want to work on and how they're going to work on it during that quarter. Another one is the Culture Humility Scale. That was developed by Hook Davis Owen in Worthington. And that also helps you determine your identity as a person in the central of what is most important to you. The next one that they came up with was more of for clients to evaluate as counselors. So this is where you can give to your clients to discuss about how they felt you were performing as being a cultural competent counselor. So there's questions: are they respectful? Are they open to explore? Do they make assumptions of what they already know? Are they open to seeing things from my perspective? Does the counselor take it as a know-it-all perspective? And that's what we talk about when I'm training students, is where future counselors is where to take the one step down approach, that we are not the expert. The client is the expert. And, we're there on their path. They're inviting us in for a period of time in their life. And we're curious about who they are, who they want to become. And we want to explore that with them. Helen.
Okay. So, after working in counselor education for almost 25 years, I think this notion of cultural humility is really important, because when you get a certain, when you've moved along the trajectory of your learning a certain amount of distance, you think, well, I know a lot of stuff. Like, I'm very knowledgeable and I'm an expert in this area. So you can get a certain amount of complacency and confidence in what you know and how you can share that with your students. Cultural humility is a characteristic in counselors I'm coming to value more and more. And I think in particular working with Asian American students, it's important to consider how you need to come from a place of not knowing as a counselor educator in order to open things up and explore things differently. So our focus was on the Asian American counselors, came from working with students who were really not satisfied with how the counselor education program had this really individualistic perspective. And especially in the certain context that we find ourselves in now with the pandemic, we really have an opportunity for counselors to play this disruptive, innovative role in society, coming out of their counseling programs. Do you want to move to the next slide, Alyssa? So one of the things we need to consider is the discrepancy between our cultural values in an individualistic society and those of the collective and relational preferences of Asian Americans. Some of the data is showing that there are 12 million individuals who describe themselves as Asian Americans, which constitutes one of the fastest growing racial groups in North America, consisting of about 4.2% of the total population and having a growth rate of 72% between 1990 and 2000. And these numbers are continuing to grow quite rapidly. But what we're confronted with is there is a gap between those who, those available to be able to provide mental health services to Asian Americans in a way that is meaningful. One of the issues is that Asian Americans underutilize mental health services. And it can be as a function of a number of different factors. One is the language gap. It can also be the a lack of understanding in terms of what mental health issues Asian Americans are confronted with. There's a vast heterogeneity of the group. So when we say Asian American, it just doesn't mean a small number of people. There are at least 52 different groups. and it can constitute Chinese, Filipino, and also the Pacific Islander. 13% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders had a diagnosable mental health illness in 2016. But we don't have enough Asian practitioners who can speak the language available to provide the services that are much needed. And Asian American individuals tend to seek assistance from family members or other senior members in their community, not unlike the Indigenous populations that we work with in Eastern Canada. Go to the next slide, Alicia. So with my students, Shirley, Kingsley, and Gloria, back in 2012, I was first confronted with this issue of really being off the mark in terms of the what we were teaching in the counselling program. My students experienced a lot of cultural distance when they came into the program, because we were focusing on theoretical orientations that were very Eurocentric, and really pushed that individualistic perspective. And they really bumped up against it hard and struggled with it. So I invited them to do some research around it and also do some interviewing of other students who were confronted with similar issues coming from diverse backgrounds. And they were able to share with us how they were able to come to a greater level of self-understanding and understanding of cultural sensitivity, and helped us as counselor educators learn how to more competently and ethically deal with not only the needs of diverse clients that they were working with in practicum, but also figuring out a better way to teach the content of our programs. So we had an appreciation of the unique values, norms, and backgrounds that shaped the development of their cultural and professional identities as counsellors. And we came to have a more deep understanding of the need for harmony with others, which leads to that care, respect, and sacrifice for others. Cut the next slide, please, Alyssa. And one of the things that is an example of the values that really emanate from their cultural norms was this notion of Gaman. Gaman is hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, is a Japanese value where the people persevere through very challenging times. Individuals develop within themselves an ability to persevere and tolerate things that are unexpected or bad and difficult to get through. That's not necessarily something that is unique only to Japanese people, but it is a deeply embedded value that is operationalized in a collective way. So Japanese people value not saying too much and suppressing negative feelings towards others. And in particular, Japanese girls are taught patience and perseverance at home and in school. The positive impact of this at a societal level is there's a low crime rate and people tend to watch out for each other. And the negative impact is that asking for help with mental health issues is perceived as a failure, which was one of the findings that was coming out of the research, where while they look out for each other, they're also expected to manage by themselves within their family unit. This can create a lot of tension. And we have noticed this coming out in some of the media over the last couple of weeks, where people are expected to manage by themselves and they're in social isolation. It can create a lot of domestic violence and workplace violence. But that tension in the home where there's no outlet and where seeking mental health outside of the home would be deemed a source of dishonoring the family. It can create a lot of stress, and in particular, it seems putting a lot of pressure on women. But it's an expected duty and seen as a sign of maturity in the culture. So we still have a lot to learn about how these deeply embedded values influence these different factors that we're thinking about.
Now this is where we want all of you to participate. We have a case study for you. So it's up here, and I'm gonna read it. Jessica is an Asian American who is a senior in high school. She's applying to colleges currently. She's growing up in a traditional Asian household. Her parents speak Mandarin and some English. Jessica speaks both English and Mandarin. If she needed help academically, she either figured out on her own or just failed. Her parents never knew her progress in school. They just expected her to do well so she could go to an Ivy League school. Jessica took the SATs and did not do well, but never let her parents know. She's currently applying to college and found out that Yale, Columbia, and Princeton denied her acceptance. She applied to the state university and got in. Jessica became very sad and upset when she received this information. She began to withdraw from friends and family. Jessica has learned that there are a couple things that are not discussed: mental health, academics, and being Americanized. Jessica decided on her own to go and see a therapist since she is 18. I'm going to stop sharing just so we can see if you raise hands or anything. So the first question we would like to ask you is, if you were Jessica's counselor, how would you begin the session? You can either put the question in the chat or unmute yourself. Does anybody want to? Okay, so Gerald asked, what are the main diagnoses they have that come? Does anybody would have a question? Caitlin said maybe ask her more about personal culture and heritage. It's a good approach. First, get to know her, right? Maybe knowing her ideas, her expectations.
Maybe asking if at some point, she would want her family to be included since they're collectivistic.
That's a good one. Another thing is the goals that she would like to get with therapy, what made her decide, to come.
What kind of ethical considerations do we have to think about? So Joyce mentions that one of the things as counselors we'd have to think about is, do we have the cultural competencies to be able to help Jessica, which is one of the first questions you'd ask. And in particular, if you're supervising students in practicum, it would be important for you to assess also your students' cultural competence and whether or not they're aware of some of the issues that might come into play.
Another, right, presenting concern, it may come from a culture perspective, right? I mean, a lot was academics was seen highly, and does she now look at it that she's failing her parents' ideas and how what was exposed to her growing up?
Assuming it really got me thinking there, because how she would describe her, ask how she would describe her presenting concern. So even how we, through an individualistic lens, would conceptualize it, we would say, well, it's the client's presenting concern, whereas a client from a more collectivist background might be describing the presenting concern in quite a different way.
Right. As the counselor, what would you know about Jessica's culture? And if you didn't know about the culture, where would you go from there?
Any ideas? I think it's important, if you don't have the cultural competence, that you seek out ways in which you could acquire it. You may have the option to refer, but it's not always possible. There are some areas in Canada where new immigrants have been brought into particular rural areas, rural and sometimes remote areas, to engage in work. For example, in Alberta on the Saskatchewan border, there's a meat processing plant there where a whole community of Somalian individuals have come in to work in that particular plant, and there's a whole community there where there are quite unique cultural issues that have influenced the school system and the mental health services being able to provide to that community. And the mental health professionals have had to really figure out how best to serve these new Canadians who've come into their community. So Sarah's suggesting it's also helpful to explore how her culture is personalized to her life. Does anybody have any ideas what Sarah means by that?
I don't know if you guys can hear me. So I would say that based on how she practices her cultural and faith and beliefs and values, so what her parents taught her, maybe not how she deals with that on a day-to-day basis. So asking her how she incorporates those traditional values or those beliefs.
That's a really great comment. Sorry, I've lost your name there in the chat box. Gerbel, I think it is. Because a lot of, if you have a family that comes into North America from their country of origin, and then they have children, young adults or teenagers Jessica's age, who are trying, especially in that time of their development, where they're trying to find their way in their own lives and they're very strongly influenced by their peers. It can create a great deal of tension for them when they're trying to establish themselves in school or university, or they're trying to get into their employment in their new culture, but they're also wanting to be respectful of the values that are embedded in their family of origin. So that tension is real, and it can be very painful, because there's almost a sense of not being dutiful to their family or being dishonorable in some way to their family. And I have worked with some young adults who have tried to navigate this, and it can be particularly stressful, where there's the pressure and the expectation that the young person is going to excel in school in order to enhance the socioeconomic status of the family. It's a family duty.
Right, and to piggyback off of that, right, and so Jessica could feel that she brought shame to the family because there was an expectation that she wasn't going to meet, and how was she going to explain that to her family because it wasn't discussed during the process of the college application. And her goal was not to bring shame to the family. I liked what Jericho, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, with the genogram, which is an important aspect too, because that's where you're going to look at the relationship patterns and traditions. So having her develop a genogram, you would also describe her relationships between her parents and others, her extended family as well. So there was maybe other expectations that were put on her that she didn't really even know about until she opens up and discusses, she was, the first with America, and we could find out that she moved and that these expectations that she'd be the first to go to college. And now what kind of disappointment does that bring to the whole family? It's not just the parents. There's a whole extended family out there. And the one thing that we learned in the relationship with Asian culture, that they don't go to therapy. You go to the older individuals in the family to talk about your problems. So here she's coming to us to talk about it. And so that's another aspect that she would have to deal with too, because if they found out that she was coming to us, what would they think about that? What would they think about not getting into college? A genogram is by Bowen, Grace. He developed it. He was a physician that developed this genogram that talks about different relationship patterns. He talked about, he had 8 concepts. One is triangulation. Another aspect was sibling position. And also he talked about where you are on levels of differentiation. If you're a high differentiated person or a low differentiated person. And a high differentiated person is able to make decisions without using emotions playing a role in your decision process, where a low differentiated person will make decisions based upon emotions instead of just intellect. And so with, how people, if you think about how you make your decisions, who's involved, I have had clients that have joked that they're low differentiated because they can't make a decision without consulting a whole team of people. Like they have to ask their parents, they have to ask everyone before they can finalize their decision, instead of just sitting there by themselves weighing the pros and cons.
Which really has some interesting implications for the choice of interventions that you use with these clients. Because Roma asked an interesting question about, is there any research on self-reflection with this population? Because even the invitation to reflect on yourself, how would that be received by someone who hasn't had the autonomy to make their own decisions without that consultation with the family members? And especially as young women, where it's valued, the values are very clearly guiding how they make their decisions for their life.
And what I've noticed on the chat, a lot of you, which is true, is to validate and compliment her for coming here, because that is a big step for her to have come to therapy. And since she was 18, she was able to come without anybody knowing. The question always happens is with, if she wasn't 18 and couldn't sign the consent form, how would this affect Jessica? Where would Jessica be if she didn't have someone to talk to? And so that's the next question, is what is the advantage that Jessica might have had if she was seeing a different therapist, an Asian American therapist, versus coming to seeing another one?
Yeah, really creating that balance between self-advocating, as mentioned in the chat, and nurturing her sense of autonomy and being able to make some decisions for herself and how she wants her life to be in North America. But balancing that, there's that tension again between not becoming, she may not want to be let go of her family of origin. She might just want to find a way forward that somehow balances all of these complex factors, which then it comes back to that notion of intersectionality. We just can't focus on one thing. We have to put it in the context of how this young woman will leave our counseling rooms and go back into the context of her life with her family. And certainly many families come by themselves. They don't have a lot of extended family in their new country, and it's not always feasible to make recommendations that may exacerbate the issues and enhance risk factors rather than help them. So some very careful decision making required.
What would be some interventions that you might use with Jessica on having her feel comfortable to open up to her family? Role play. That's a good idea. I mean, giving her the courage to talk to them. Motivational interviewing. Narrative therapy. That's a good with narrative therapy, having her rewrite her story. So she would be reauthoring how her path would look. And I've used a lot of narrative therapy, and I have my clients think about, if they're writing a book, what would the title of the book, what would each chapter look like in each of their new sections. So it'd be interesting with Jessica is like, how would she start with chapter 1? What would be the introduction to this? How would she change her role as the daughter, and maybe even just her role in this family dynamic?
Yeah, I think it would be really valuable in terms of externalizing the problem, so she doesn't see herself as problematic, and trying to nurture some hope in that respect, so that she can open up some of her perspectives a little bit more.
You've been getting to think about, what is it like for Jessica in this whole thing? You know, how did, when she grew up, the expectations that were placed, and how did she know about these expectations? How were they portrayed? And how can she shift these expectations differently, that they would fit in this world for her? Yeah, another one, like to change her role without disrespecting, right? Respect is very highly encouraged in this family. So, right, her changing the expectations, would that be a disrespect to the family culture, the family norms? What is one way, I know I read above in the chat room, was keeping her in therapy. What would be ways to encourage her to remain coming back to therapy? Focusing on the goals in progress, yeah. And also the cultural identity and conflict that the parents, also discussing how to, introducing the change. Like if she can't, she did something one week and comes back and discusses it, and validating her for the change and the goals. Showing that encouragement that maybe she doesn't get, or the encouragement is different for her at home. Any other suggestions? Okay. I'll share again for the conclusion. Helen.
So what you can see from the case study, that there are some barriers that exist at a cultural level in terms of attempting to encourage more Asian American students to seek out professional training as counselors because of the deeply embedded values of their families of origin. So it would be trying to figure out some ways in which we could bridge, create a bridge so that we, it's kind of like a two-pronged approach. We want to enhance our competencies as counselors, our cultural competencies as counselors, so we have a more in-depth and sophisticated understanding of the needs of Asian Americans as this rapidly growing population in our countries, and also creating opportunities and thinking about how we are setting up our professional training programs so that they don't have this individualistic lens, but rather we're thinking more of a collectivist approach, and that rather than seeing courses like diversity in counseling as an elective, for example, as you see in some curriculum, or in some programs not even part of the curriculum, but making it front and center in terms of having an understanding of the local communities in which the students will serve, and the needs of the individuals in the communities, and then being able to build our training in a way that makes sense. And finding a way to encourage Asian Americans to enter the field of counseling. So we need to figure out as well, it's not like Alyssa and I have got answers to this, it's really opening up the conversation and saying, hey, we're seeing a gap here. We're seeing a need that needs to be filled, because in the future, as a function of how our world is rapidly changing and how demographics in North America are rapidly changing, we need to prepare ourselves and be forward thinking in how we'll address the needs of not just some of our citizens in our communities, but all of our citizens, and working collaboratively with them to come up with some solutions.
We have some professional development opportunities where, you have the American Council Association, the American Psycho Association, and the Canadian Association as well. And there's the Asian American Psychological Association. And all of these have run different types of, courses that you can take for more development. I've always encouraged my students to look into different courses, to expose themselves, and to have different types of trainings to help as well. That concludes our presentation. I don't know if you have any questions or comments. I know we only have like a minute left or something.
Alyssa, this is Lori Ann Stretch. I just want to remind everybody that if you don't have your full name posted on your video, we cannot award you CE credits. So I see a lot of names that aren't full names, and so I just want to make sure everybody's getting credit. So you need to click on your video feed, and there's 3 dots. Click on that, hit rename, and change your name, or you will not be able to earn credit. So please, please make sure your name's correct. Thank you so much, Alyssa. And thank you, Helen, for being here.
Thank you.
I love you. Thank you.
Yeah, back to a few minutes, but I know people are logging in, for the next session. So if you do want a couple of questions, or
We're having trouble hearing you.
yeah, I've been having issues.
Can you call in? Can you use the phone audio option and just use the video for the computer for the video?
I don't know how to do that with the CMHC account.
Same thing. You just go down to the bottom where it says mute. There's a little caret beside it. You click on that, and then you say audio settings. You can switch to phone audio.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. It's really hard to hear you.
Because
It may be a little odd of a question, but for some Asian Americans, being one myself, recognition can feel a little, for lack of a better term, icky. And I know that throughout this conversation, we were kind of saying, oh, well, recognize her for having the strength to come in and recognizing her for, accepting this help. Is there a way to approach that if, what if that is her situation where she's like, oh, I didn't realize this is weird, or, I know it wasn't encouraged, but I'm just wondering if there's like a way to deal with that.
and when you say it wasn't, can you explain